Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing our pre-event slideshow. Gold text on a white background, live from NYPL logo. Live from NYPL and the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers present Stepchildren of the Shtetl, Natan Meir with Jonathan Stevenson, October 22nd, 2020 at 7 p.m. EDT. This slide contains an image of the featured book jacket. White and black text on a teal background reads, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, the destitute, disabled, and mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 through 1939, Natan M. Meir. In the center is an image of a figure sitting outside, bundled up in heavy winter clothing, with their head down and arms hugging their chest. The image is hazy, as if viewed through a thick fog. Black text on a white background. Stepchildren of the Shtetl is available for purchase online from the library shop, nypl.org/shop. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Plus, receive a free commemorative 125th anniversary tote bag with your purchase. This slide contains an image of the same featured book jacket for Stepchildren of the Shtetl. Black text on a white background. This title and more are available in accessible formats for community members who do not use standard print. Find out more at nypl.org/talkingbooks. Recommended reading. Natan Meir suggests these titles for further reading. A City in Its Fullness by Shmuel Yosef Agnon. Jewish Poland Revisited, Heritage Tourism in Unquiet Places by Erica Lehrer. When Brooklyn Was Queer by Hugh Ryan. Find these and other great reads in NYPL's collections, browse.nypl.org. Contactless checkout is now available at 50 grab-and-go locations. nypl.org/grab-and-go. Accessible formats are available for community members who do not use standard print. nypl.org/talkingbooks. Black text on a white background. Read, think, vote. Make an informed decision. Read as if your vote depends on it. NYPL's 2020 election reading list is available at nypl.org/election2020. Find accessible versions of these books at bit.ly/accessible-election-reads. This slide features a blue box with a line of red, white, and blue stars running across the middle, and images of 12 different book jackets from the election reading list, including America for Americans, Our Time Is Now, The End of ICE, Begin Again, No Justice in the Shadows, This Changes Everything, Drawing the Vote, Unrigged, Good Talk, Give Us the Ballot, Why We're Polarized, and Push Out. Black text on a white background. Live from NYPL presents the Harry Belafonte Black Liberation Speaker Series, with thanks to Kenneth Cole. Monday, October 26th at 8 p.m. EDT. Malcolm X, The Facts and the Fictions. Discover the monumental new biography of one of the 20th century's most relevant figures, 30 years in the making. The Dead Are Arising, featuring Tamara Payne and Reverend Calvin O. Butts III, co-presented with NYPL's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Monday, November 16th, 8 p.m. EDT. Raven Leilani and Kylie Reed. Two debut best-selling authors come together to discuss the particular struggles that young Black women face trying to navigate their ways towards happiness and success inside of white worlds. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.
Welcome to the New York Public Library. Tonight, we present another in our new series of virtual conversations from the Coleman Center, a presentation with live from the NYPL. Past Coleman Center fellow Natan Meir will discuss his new book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, The Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1939. He is joined in conversation by Jonathan Stevenson, a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the managing editor of the journal Survival. My name is Salvatore Scibona, Sue Ann and John Weinberg, director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars at the New York Public Library. As some of you know, the Coleman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, intensive access to our collections, and a living stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come to the library to use the unparalleled collections housed here to write the books of tomorrow. The program was founded in 1999. To date, it has supported the work of more than 300 fellows. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply. In the coming days, Live will present an event on October 26th with Tamara Payne, speaking about her late father Les Payne's newly released seminal biography of Malcolm X, The Dead Are Rising, as part of the Harry Belafonte Black Liberation series. In November, also as part of that series, novelists Kylie Reed and Raven Leilani will come together to speak about their debut novels, Luster and Such a Fun Age. If you want to register for any of these or check out our other fantastic events at Live from NYPL, go to nypl.org/live. You can also keep up to date with all of our events and everything else the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter. For that, go to nypl.org/connect. You can purchase Stepchildren of the Shtetl through the library's shop. Just go to nypl.org/shop. You can also find the link on YouTube, and we'll drop it right here. I've just seen it in the Zoom as well. Purchase now, and you'll receive a free NYPL 125th anniversary tote to carry it in. Real-time captions for this program are available through Stream Text. You can find the link in the reminder email you received after signing up for tonight's event, as well as in the chats in Zoom and on YouTube. Before I invite Natan and Jonathan, there are just a few quick housekeeping items I have to go over. This event is being recorded, not you, only the event itself, that is Natan and Jonathan, also and myself. Natan will take some of your questions at the end of his conversation with Jonathan. You can send them at any time during this conversation by typing your questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the Zoom app, or into the chat, and also into YouTube, or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. That's public programs, no space, at nypl.org. And while you're in the chat, say hello, let us know where you're watching from and what you're reading. Natan speaks tonight with Jonathan Stevenson. Jonathan Stevenson conducts primary research, publishes and comments on U.S. defense, Middle East security, and counterterrorism. He writes frequently for the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. From 2005 through 2016, he was professor of strategic studies in the Strategic Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. From 2011 to 13, he served as National Security Council Director for Political Military Affairs, Middle East, and North Africa in the Obama White House. He has published several books and numerous policy articles on terrorism, political Islam, and Middle Eastern and African security in journals such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and The National Interest. From 2017 to 2018 as a Coleman Center Fellow, he worked on his forthcoming cultural biography of Philip Agee, the only CIA officer to turn against the agency for ideological reasons and expose US intelligence officers and agents. He shared the Coleman Center that year with our friend and colleague, the writer Natan Meir. From his groundbreaking research on the Jews of Russia to his work as a consultant for Moscow's Jewish Museum, Professor Natan Meir has earned an international reputation as a scholar of Jewish social, cultural, and religious history. His latest book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, recovers the history of Jewish Eastern Europe's social outcasts, the disabled, the mentally ill, orphans, and beggars, and he is currently engaged in a new project on folklore, magic, and sexuality in European Jewish culture. He speaks 8 languages. His previous work includes Kiev, Jewish Metropolis, A History, 1859 to 1914. Find out more about Natan's work at the website Natan Meir, NatanMeir.com. That's visible also in the chat. At this point, I invite you to welcome with me my friends Jonathan Stevenson and Natan Meir.
Well, I guess I should start. It's a real treat and actually also a privilege to be here to discuss Natan's book with him, because he is not only a smart guy, but he is a very good man. So we get two virtues in one person. I met Natan when we were both fellows at the Coleman Center. And that was in 2016 to 17. It was a very eventful year. But we did manage to get some work done. His project was the fascinating book that we're going to discuss tonight, which concerns, broadly speaking, marginalized characters in Eastern European Jewish society in the 19th and 20th centuries. The subject wasn't exactly in my wheelhouse. As Salvatore said, I was researching a book on a notorious CIA turncoat, but Natan had me hooked when he mentioned over lunch early on in our fellowships that among the people he was investigating were town fools. I knew of this type really only as a kind of juvenile joke from Warner Brothers cartoons and things like that. And I hadn't fully registered that they really existed and mordantly served a social purpose. And as our conversation continued over the course of our time at the Coleman Center, Natan also told me about the cholera wedding. In fact, I think I once urged him to title the book The Cholera Wedding, but I like the current title, which I found even more poignant and heartbreaking. Natan, perhaps you could describe the ritual of the cholera wedding and tell us how it, and for that matter, other things that you discuss, including town fools and other modes of social marginalization, relate to the broader themes of stepchildren of the shtetl.
Sure, absolutely. But first, I want to tell you, Jonathan, how happy I am to see you here tonight and that we're doing this event together. It's especially meaningful to me because we had a great group that year, but you do stand out in my memory as someone who was really genuinely enthusiastic about my project and really encouraging of my work. And that meant a lot, actually, because you walk into the New York Public Library, you're like, oh my God, what am I doing here? They really chose me, and that kind of gave me a fillip, and it was really helpful. So I appreciate that a lot, and it's good to be talking with you tonight. So the cholera wedding, yes. So we call it the cholera wedding. Actually, in Yiddish, it was often called Schwarze Chasana, which is a black wedding, or Magefa Chasana, which is an epidemic wedding, which is actually more appropriate because it started out as a ritual to ward off a cholera epidemic, but then in the 20th century, it was used for other epidemics as well. And in fact, just a few months ago, it became a COVID-19 wedding when it was replayed in Israel, in a cemetery in Israel. So the cholera wedding emerged, I argue, sometime in the early, actually not sometime, in 1831, which is when the first cholera pandemic was sweeping the Russian Empire. And it seems to have been a kind of mystical, magical remedy to try to ward off the cholera epidemic by marrying two poor orphans in the cemetery, marrying them to each other. And as it developed over the 19th century, especially in the 1860s through the 1890s, it seems to have incorporated all of the marginalized people, the outcasts that I discuss in my book, into the ceremony, so that you start hearing stories about beggars being married to developmentally disabled people, or someone with some kind of physical deformity being married to someone who is known as a madman or a madwoman. So basically anyone who never had a chance of getting married because those people were not considered fit to be matched to other people, and they're at the physical and metaphorical outskirts of the Jewish community, they are brought in. And essentially, as far as we can tell, they don't have much choice in this. So they're compelled to marry someone like them in terms of kind of sociological category, someone like them in the cemetery. And that was understood by some people to be a way to stop the epidemic. And then it continues, as I mentioned before, it continues in the early 20th century when you have typhus and the influenza epidemic. And then eventually we find it emerging again during the Holocaust. So it also pops up, by the way, in the land of Israel and Palestine, and also in the United States and Canada. So it has tremendous staying power. And interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to have appeared any time before the early 19th century, although people always said to me, well, there must be some precedent for it, or there must be some parallel in Christian society that you can find. And I mean, it's a complicated story, but ultimately, what I argue is that it really is the child of modernity of the 19th century. And maybe we'll get into why that is later on. But in my book, the cholera wedding is basically the middle chapter. It's chapter 4 of 7, and that means that it's at the center, which is very apt because the roots of it reach back into the pre-modern period. And as I mentioned, it continues all the way into the mid 20th century. So it kind of really covers the entire scope of the history that I'm trying to delve into here. And it's really imbricated with the other phenomena that I talk about in the book. You mentioned town fools, so that was someone who was a pretty good, let's say, victim, right, of the people who were interested in finding a cholera bride or a cholera groom, would be to take the town fool, as they were known, and to marry them off. And there's also a connection to another phenomenon, which is the hekdesh, the Jewish poorhouse, which was pretty ubiquitous in Eastern Europe. And many of the people who would have been married off in the wedding live in the poorhouse, and usually in pretty dire conditions. So, you asked about how does the cholera wedding connect to the main theme of the book, and the book is really about how. And it tries to be about these marginal people themselves and try to understand the lives that they led. And that's one aspect of the book. But the kind of the larger argument is that they served as a symbol, as a kind of surrogate for East European Jewry as a whole. And in that way, they were kind of like a doppelganger onto which the mainstream of Jewish society can kind of project all of its fears and anxieties, and sometimes even its own self-loathing. So one of my explanations of the cholera wedding is that it was kind of a scapegoating ritual, and it was meant to symbolically transfer the evil of the epidemic from the community onto the cholera bride and the cholera groom, onto the outcasts of the community. And so in that way, it kind of encapsulates this argument that I'm making about these outcasts serving as scapegoats, serving really important symbolic function in the self-understanding of East European Jewry. And the outcasts, these marginalized people, really, they kind of represent what Jews don't want the outside world to see about Jewish society, about everything that is backward or that is ugly or that seems to be deformed about Jewish society. That generally, in this period, the mid to late 19th century, people who are interested in kind of Jewish modernization, they don't want Russian society or Christian society to see that side of the Jewish community. And ultimately, many modernizing Jews are looking to kind of bring the Jewish community into Europe, into European society, into civilization. And the cholera wedding, in some ways, tries to do that. It takes these people who are backward or were deviant, and it tries to normalize them by marrying them, because otherwise they would never be married. And people who were unmarried were generally considered outside of the norm in Jewish society. So that's another way that the cholera wedding is really representative of these larger ideas that I'm trying to get at in the book.
Right, but although it marries them and it normalizes them, it also keeps them separate in a way, doesn't it?
It does, yes, it does,
Yeah.
because it marries them to each other. And
Right.
To the extent that we ever hear descriptions of what happens to this couple after they're married in the cholera wedding, very often we hear, well, beforehand they were begging separately, now they beg together, and then their kids become beggars too. So it kind of it perpetuates the cycle of marginalization. Yeah.
Right. Let me maybe a slight tangent. Staying on the subject of the cholera wedding, I wonder if we could frame its resonance in the era of COVID-19. And the reason for this tangent is that last April, you published an I thought unusually insightful op-ed on this point, entitled "The Cholera Wedding and Its Meaning for Our Time" in the Los Angeles Review of Books. And as I read the piece, you talk basically about three possible functions for the ritual of the cholera wedding. There's sort of redemption through charity for the unfortunate, scapegoating, as you point out, through the ostracization of the other, and then just inspirational defiance of disease. We're going to behave normally, damn the disease.
We don't know anything about that, do we, these days?
Yeah, right. None of these things is purely altruistic. So I wonder, how do you think the cholera wedding is relevant in the present moment?
Well, first of all, I should say, I really wish it weren't relevant. That would be the best thing of all. But yeah, I mean, that piece in the LA Review of Books, it kind of, I felt in the first few weeks after the pandemic began that I was like, I have something to say about this. I just don't really know what it is yet. And then at some point, it just kind of, it all came together. And it's not a long piece. I wrote it in an evening. But basically what I'm trying to say is that there's two ways that we can interpret the meaning of the cholera wedding for today, for the COVID time. And one of them is very dark, which is, we say the most vulnerable people in our society, those who are essentially whoever are the counterparts in America of the 21st century to the outcasts that I'm talking about in the book. But really what I'm talking about are people who are the most vulnerable to the epidemic. So poor people and people of color and, all kinds of other marginalized people in our society who we know statistically are probably going to be more likely to get sick. They should be at the center of our concern. But ultimately what happened was that they were sacrificed. This is the way I see it. They were sacrificed for the questionable cause of opening up the economy. And instead of having at least a discussion about, okay, we open up, but then we're going to shelter these people. Like, I think they've had that kind of discussion in the UK to some extent.
Yeah.
It was basically just, we just have to do it. And, if there's collateral damage, then it is what it is. And so I saw this really frightening parallel. And then I also argued, well, there's another road to take, which is to kind of transform the cholera wedding and say, okay, we're going to take the most vulnerable people and we're going to kind of lift them up and let's say shelter them within the embrace of the community at the same time that we're trying to fight the epidemic and all of its all of its other impacts on society. But that hasn't happened.
Right. And I think you do say that on balance, it would be best if we could relegate the legacy of the cholera wedding to history. But having said that, the cholera wedding and the other practices that you've studied have shaped modern perceptions of the Jewish people, and including, I think you say, the perceptions of Jews of the Jewish people themselves. And you write, and I'm going to quote here, the Jewish marginal people of Eastern Europe became a symbol of East European Jewry as a whole, and a development that modernizers both advanced unwittingly and lamented, and that modernists later embraced, which is a sentence that's just pregnant with profundity, I think, and you do flesh out the argument in very compelling detail in the epilogue to the book, and perhaps you could do so now, more briefly. How exactly did modernists and others embrace the symbol of marginalized Jews?
Right. Well, I think it won't be a surprise to anyone if I say that modernist writers, and this is certainly not true only for writers in Hebrew or in Yiddish, but for any modernist writers, they're often marginalized themselves. That's probably one of the ways that they develop this amazing lens on society. And so their artistic vision often allows them to see society for all that it is, warts and all. And obviously the warts are what are most interesting to us in this case. And I think that especially for the writers that I look at in the book, the marginalized figure could kind of be used as an artistic tool to explore all the different aspects of Jewish society, including its underbelly, which was, as I mentioned before, this was a very sensitive topic at the time for Jews, as it is for any minority, right? Which is very conscious of its image and its perception in the eyes of the larger society. And in some of them, I'm thinking of Yudlam Peretz, of Y.L. Peretz, who was the foremost Yiddish modernist of his day. Really of all time. So I'm talking about the early 20th century, and he used the figure of the madman and the madwoman to kind of get at the Jewish collective subconscious, and that in and of itself is really compelling. But for me, obviously, I was interested in connecting it to this larger question of how are the outcasts of Jewish society being perceived and how are they being portrayed. But the argument that I try to make in the book is that over and against the larger thrust of bourgeois Jewish society, progressives, philanthropists, do-gooders of various kinds who were, as I said, pretty anxious about the growing numbers of beggars and poor orphans and who were often on the streets of the cities of Russia and Poland. So they're trying to implement all kinds of strategies to usually either transform these people in some way or to institutionalize them, to put them into mental hospitals, maybe even workhouses. That was raised at a few points. And the modernist writers, and not only them, but also, let's say, folklorists and people who are on the cutting edge of the social welfare movement, historians, they start to see these people as not something to be gotten rid of, but as something that is actually central in some ways to Jewish society. And obviously, nationalism is becoming more and more important at this time, right? Late 19th, early 20th century across Europe. So Zionism is on the rise, and there's a desire to try to get at the essence of the folk, of the people, right? What is the essential nature of the people? And these outcasts paradoxically begin to be seen as possibly the kind of repository of some kind of essence, some kind of repository of folklore sometimes, right? It's a kind of a complex dynamic, but they become more valuable. And the modernist writers are writing about them. You have filmmakers who start to make films about them. Folklorists are writing about them because they seem to represent something that's really distinctive and unique about the Jewish experience, as opposed to something that needs to be shoved to the margins in some way.
Oh, here's a little wrinkle that occurred to me, and that is that the notion of Jews as distinctively weak would naturally be especially sensitive and problematic in the wake of the Holocaust. And indeed, you point out in the book that Zionists and Jewish nationalists are, to use your phrase, profoundly ambivalent about the disabled Jewish body and psyche. So I'm wondering whether you think this ambivalence has ramifications in contemporary Jewish politics and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. There is, as you say, exactly, or actually, as I said originally,
As you said,
there's this profound ambivalence about, the Jewish cripple, as they would have been called, or madmen or madwomen, because because they represent the worst of the Jewish situation. And this, of course, is at a moment in the late 19th, early 20th century when things look pretty grim for Jews in Eastern Europe, and in some ways in other places as well, but especially there. And so they symbolize how bad things can get, but at the same time, they also represent, if they can be healed or repaired or transformed in some way, then they hold tremendous potential for the Jewish future. And what's really interesting is that I think you're actually the first person who's asked me about the ramifications of my work for the contemporary Jewish scene. Yeah, which is interesting because you're not in my field.
Either I'm very smart or very stupid.
Well, I know which one I'm going for, but what I think of, first of all, when you ask that question, are the Haredim, or the ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society. I mean, obviously we could also, because they are in some ways the ultimate other with a capital O in Israeli society, although, obviously we could talk about Palestinian Israelis. They are also tremendously other in Israeli society. We could talk about Ethiopian Jews again. But I'm thinking about the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim here, because they physically, they seem to be a kind of reminder of that East European, the stereotypical East European Jew that had been left behind by the Zionist enterprise. By physically, obviously, I mean, black frock coats and side curls and wigs. Not that every East European Jew looked like that, but I'm talking about the stereotypical vision here. And I do think that right now there's even more anxiety about the ultra-Orthodox than there normally is, because the rates of COVID-19 are so much higher in their communities for complicated reasons. And so there's, strangely enough, I mean, it's just amazing, but just as in Eastern Europe, there was often a linkage between the Jew and disease. Obviously, that was pretty central to some anti-Semitic tropes. There is a linkage today too between in Israeli society between the ultra-Orthodox Jew, who's kind of stereotypically Eastern European or represents that background, and disease as well. So that is for me, that's just interesting to contemplate why that might be. And I think also in a larger sense, I think Israel today, even as far as it's come from its founding roots, I think that Israeli society continues to live with the shadow of that Jewish outcast. And one of the reasons for the emphasis on militarism and machismo, and strength in Israeli society, and on the narrative of heroism in Jewish history, is that we don't want that. We want to push away and forget about that idea of the weak diaspora Jew, the neurotic ghetto Jew, right? All of this ties into the idea of the beggar and the madman, and the outcast more generally. So I think that actually does live on in certain ways in Israeli society.
Yeah, that was my sense too. Now I don't want to put you on the spot for too long about current events and contemporary politics. So let's revert to the historical perspective. It seems to me in any case that Jews, like other people, have always harbored mixed feelings about the poor, the sick, and the mentally challenged. But Jews also seem to have gone to some lengths to culturally redeem such people, at least in an indirect way. And what I'm thinking about is the tale of the seven beggars, which you recount in the book, and which essentially casts them, marginal people, as sort of like upright personages in disguise. Is this kind of folklore, how did it shake out? Did it ultimately serve to integrate marginal people or merely to isolate and stigmatize them further?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very perceptive question. I'll just explain first that the tale of the seven beggars is one of a very fascinating, compelling series of tales that were told by a Hasidic master in early 19th century Eastern Europe, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. And I think, so you mentioned that these people in the tales are often, I think you said the word upright, right? They're kind of upright in disguise.
Very normative, loaded term, but
well, I think that
like
actually
pillars of the community.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think that answers the question, actually, as I would answer it, because the essence of it is that they're not actually the outcasts at all. You know what I mean? They're actually righteous people often in disguise, right? And therefore, if you lift the veil, you will find who's really there. And that's actually a long trope in Jewish folklore. You have the idea of the Messiah who's actually disguised as a beggar at the gates of Rome, who's wrapping and unwrapping his bandages. And so in theory, I think there is a way in which one can use this idea to look with compassion upon every single beggar, because you say, well, maybe he's the Messiah. But then there's the flip side of it, which is that in the tales, well, that beggar isn't actually a beggar after all. They're actually, they're actually someone else in disguise. And so there is a lot of ambivalence about those figures. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, this might be a related point. You say, I don't know why I glommed onto this particular sentence. You say, or phrase really, the archetypal Jewish town had an array of set characters: the fool, the cripple, the informer, perhaps even the town ghost. Now, non-Jewish modernists, and I was thinking particularly of Faulkner, but there are others, have portrayed putatively marginalized people as not only in some way integral to the society, but also by implication, morally superior to their so-called betters. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, does this dynamic operate at all in the Jewish tradition that you examine in your book?
Yeah, absolutely, without question. I mentioned, actually, did I mention before? And I don't know, I don't remember anymore, but probably I didn't. Shinyud Agnon, or who's known as Shai Agnon, who's the Nobel Prize winning Hebrew writer who just wrote the most amazing works, both about life in the land of Israel and also in Eastern Europe. He wrote a short story that I look at in the book called Ovadia the Cripple, And this guy, Ovadia, is actually the laughingstock of his town. But ultimately, he's shown to be morally superior, as you said, morally superior to almost everyone else in his community. And what I've known shows is that that has a lot to do with the fact that he kind of connects to his own vulnerability and is able to acknowledge it. There's also there's a theme of Zionism and nationalism that runs through there as well, which is also important. But there's definitely a kind of a regeneration of character that happens there, which I think Agnon is saying that's the regeneration that's really needed when we talk about Jewish nationalism, and not so much creating some kind of Jewish Superman, or Muskel Judentum, kind of a muscle Judaism, but a more sensitive kind of Jewish soul, which is able to acknowledge its own vulnerabilities. So I think of that when I think of this question about moral superiority. And then also there's this great Yiddish film, which people should try to get a hold of if they can through the National Center for Jewish Film, which is called The Light Ahead. It's based on a Yiddish novel from the 19th century about the Jewish underclass. And the Yiddish film is from 1939, and the heroes of the film are a blind, crippled man, all right, as he's known again in the film, right? This is not my term, and a blind woman, and they are both physically beautiful, but also morally so far beyond the villains of their town, the Jewish leadership, who are portrayed as terribly immoral. So yeah, you can definitely see that thread running through it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess I've had, there's a sort of it seems to be a more insidious vector that emerges in the book, in the form of the hektish, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah.
It's you call it a locus for the grotesque. And I'm using your words here also, I hope not out of context, that helps to explain why at times the Jewish mainstream is seemingly so eager to displace onto its marginals the opprobrium heaped upon Jews by anti-Semites. And I'm wondering, is it too big a leap to say that the assortment of outcasts whom you explore sometimes acted as a repository for a kind of self-loathing, arising from doubts planted by anti-Semitism? And if that's correct, if that's valid, was the eventual cultural solution simply a more thorough separation between the mainstream and marginal, or is that an oversimplification?
Well, I think it's actually not a leap at all. I think that actually pretty accurately restates what I try to argue in the book, which is that there was self-loathing among Jews, and that is, and there continues to be. I mean, it hasn't gone away. I mean, that's just, it kind of has this ongoing relationship with anti-Semitism, and there's the struggle with self-loathing, and I think that has a lot to do with the way people perceive the outcasts of the Jewish community. I don't know that. I'm not sure. You asked about a solution. I don't know if they ever actually reached a solution. I don't think that ultimately, if we look, for example, at Poland in the 1920s and 1930s, I don't think that the consensus was that more separation between the mainstream and the marginals was the answer. I think that both as the modernist writers, right, that I was talking about, folklorists and historians and so on and so forth, all of them basically say in one way or another, we need to embrace these people and kind of reintegrate them into the Jewish community. There's really no other way to do it. Did that actually happen? No, it didn't happen, and because there were just too many of them, and the Jewish society in Poland at the time was just struggling with too many different challenges to be able to make that a success as well. But there was the beginning of a movement towards that, which was all reversed during the Holocaust. But the story in the Soviet Union is probably slightly different. We don't really have time to get into that right now. But I think generally the trend in the 20th century is probably more positive than negative, meaning more towards integration of these people rather than than continued separation.
Yeah, and so it's an ongoing struggle that Jews have been forced to confront, perhaps more directly than others. And that seems to tie in with a notion, this notion of liminality that I guess, as I'm reading that, the transition from traditional to modern society, transitional state, which does seem to be a fairly pervasive theme in Stepchildren of the Shtetl. The cholera wedding you suggest is an example of a liminal phenomenon occurring in an era, I'm quoting you again, because you write well, in an era of transition from the familiar to an unknown and possibly dangerous future. Am I reading you correctly? Do you see the cholera wedding as an attempt to reconcile the traditional with the modern?
It's less a reconciliation, actually, I would say, than tradition, or maybe actually we would better say traditionalists, right? Because it's tradition that has some vague meanings, but these are people who are very aware of modernity, but clinging to tradition. So traditionalism thumbing its nose at modernity. And let me explain just basically what I mean. Throughout European society, when we look at epidemics, very often, especially among ordinary people, there's a reaction against what the governmental authorities say is the right thing to do during an epidemic. And why not? Because those authorities treat them like crap most of the the rest of the time. So why should they trust them when public health authorities say, well, you should do this and you should do that, quarantine or whatever else they're telling them to do. And there were often riots against the public health authorities because of that. Now, Jews didn't riot against their authorities, but I suspect that there was some kind of, this is kind of a pushback and the people that we see organizing these weddings are usually, we'll call them ritual experts who are women, right? They may have been known as well, maybe witches is not the right term. I don't know, but they certainly were seen as experts in Jewish magic, and they're the ones who tend to be most wary of modernity and all that it has to bring. And so the way I see the cholera wedding is as a kind of revolt against modernity, against modern medicine, all of the kind of notables of the Jewish community who are saying we need to take these measures against the epidemic and so on and so forth. And then the masses are saying, no thanks, we'll take the old-time religion. And that's what the cholera wedding represents. Although actually, as I said, it's actually an innovative ritual, but it still represents this idea that there's some sort of ancient magical remedies against epidemics that are going to be more effective than modern medicine will be.
Right. There's a notion in the second half of the book, and I think we've basically spoken to it and talked at least around it. But this notion of the transformation of the Jewish outcast into a national icon in the early 20th century, and I just wondered if you'd perhaps explain that and briefly connect the dots a little bit. How is this connected with the prior treatment of the marginal in Eastern European Jewish society?
Right. Well, the way I describe it in the book is maybe this is an oversimplification, but in the end, historians have to do a little bit of oversimplifying. Otherwise, we're not really going to be able to make our argument. Which is that there's this kind of arc from the pre-modern period when these marginalized people were somewhat better integrated into Jewish society. For example, there was a system by which beggars or vagrants, wandering people, would be given a place to stay in someone's home, and they would be given a meal, especially if they were there over the Sabbath. And that system tends to break down in the period that I'm talking about in the book, in the 19th century and the early 20th century. there's something about the process of modernization that causes many people who see themselves in the mainstream to want to, as I said before, to kind of push away to the very margins, or hide or get rid of the people who they see as representing the worst about Jewish society. And then ultimately, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's this process, the incomplete process of reintegration and of trying to hold up that marginalized person, that outcast, as a symbol of the Jewish people, which the Zionists do at various points. The Jewish socialists, the Bundists, also tend to do that. I mean, this is a complicated process. It's also a little bit problematic because they're not always talking about the actual people, right? They're talking about the outcast as a symbol. And so, the extent to which those people are actually treated better in the 20s and the 30s is a question. But that's the kind of general arc of the argument.
Got 2 more points and 2 more questions, and then we'll go to Q&A from others. You point out that since the end of the Second World War, you're going to have to use your words, a yawning chasm has swallowed up the world with which this book has occupied itself. Even so, you continue, our subject lives beyond the Nazi invasion of Poland, and even in a sense beyond the killing years of 1941 and 1942. So however submerged, the stepchildren of the shtetl remain part of a live history that still resonates in present day Europe, at least as I'm reading you. And that must be one reason that you conduct study tours to that part of the world. Is that one of the things you hope to expose the people whom you're showing that part of the world to?
Yeah, I think I do. I'm not sure that I thought about that way before, but when I do lead these study tours to Eastern Europe, one of my goals is to show people the Jewish culture that existed in all of its colors, and all of its vibrancy and all of its dynamism, which included these marginal folk, which included these outcasts. And although we're seeing beautiful synagogues, right, that's not the only thing that I want people to think about are the rabbis and the scholars and the notable Jews who built those. Of course, they're also important, but also the poor people, the working class people, the marginalized folk who made up a very important part of Jewish society as well. So yeah, actually, that's true.
I don't know if have you lost my visual, by the way?
No, I can see you.
Oh, you can. I somehow did something that caused me to lose your visual, but I'm going to ask you the last question anyway. At the end of the epilogue, which by the way is epic, you note Isaac Bashevis Singer's suspicion of an aggressive Nietzschean human will, and observe that Singer's short story Gimple the Fool empowers the marginal Jewish figure such that he now speaks, quoting you, not only for himself, but for the entire world that has oppressed and taunted him, end quote. This dispensation seems to run counter to any stark separation between the mainstream and the marginal. So my final question to you is, what, if any, is the contemporary message in this? Should we look to the enlightened schlemiel, and that's a term you used a couple of pages earlier, enlightened schlemiel, just schlemiel. Should we look to the enlightened schlemiel for salvation?
I like the term enlightened schlemiel.
Oh, good.
And I'm going to answer this briefly because I think that the folks backstage want us to move to the questions that have been coming in. But the short answer is yes, we should look to the enlightened schlemiel for salvation. I think that maybe it's hackneyed to say this today. I hope not. We need to understand our marginals, the margins of society, in order to understand who we are as a society. And I mean, I'm thinking of the racial justice movement that's going on right now, and I'm thinking of this fantastic idea that I heard on NPR a couple of months ago about Black women best, which is that if you ensure that Black women in our society are being treated fairly and have good opportunities, then you know that everyone in society is being treated fairly and has good opportunities. So if you can kind of, pay attention to and lift up the marginals and yes, maybe look to the enlightened Schlemiel, depending, maybe they're not always enlightened, I don't know, but definitely the margins of society have a tremendous amount to teach us, and we ignore them at our peril.
Very good. Excellent laydown, and obviously some good questions. I think people seem very interested in the cholera wedding. I see two questions, 2 out of the 4 that I see. Do you want to address the first one on how the cholera wedding was believed to stop the pandemic? I think you've spoken to that, but maybe a little.
Yeah, right. I can explain that. I didn't get to that part of it, which is actually pretty important, and so that's a good opportunity. The standard explanation within Jewish circles, and especially if you were going to look to a rabbi or a scholar for an explanation of the cholera wedding, was that because it was a great charitable deed to wed these 2 people who would otherwise not be able to get married, and generally in Jewish society, it's considered, this goes back to antiquity, it's considered a great charitable deed to dower the needy bride, for example, to enable people to get married who cannot otherwise get married. Therefore, this would kind of appease God's wrath, and in a sense, enable the community to bridge the gap that had been created between itself and God, and in the form, that takes the form of the epidemic. So that was generally how it was explained. We don't actually have any explanation from the people who organize it themselves, because everything is reported second or third hand, and the narratives don't usually contain any kind of explanation. They just laid it down as, this is going to help, this is the segula, this is the remedy, and that was pretty much the end of it. The questioner also asked if it's currently being practiced in Hasidic communities, and the only one that I've heard of is the one that took place in Bnei Brak, which is an ultra-Orthodox city in Israel, and that happened in April, I believe. As far as I know, it's not been practiced generally, and it's actually been pretty rare since the late 19-teens. As I mentioned, there were a few incidents of it during the Holocaust, and then of course we have the latest one that happened in April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A second question here points out that the marginalized are seen in some ways as representing the essence of the culture. There's a question, are they in some way fetishized? And the questioner paraphrases this by saying, is there a way of seeing them as other and not fully human? Now, I suppose that can cut 2 ways. One, that there's something more than human, or that there's something less than human.
Yes, it can, right, exactly. It can cut both ways, because, and I don't know about more than human, but definitely supernatural, because
supernatural, right.
In the pre-modern period, there was a tendency to see people who had, kind of, who were different in some way, right? They're different physically, or they're different cognitively, and that is seen as coming from God, and therefore it's a mark of God's, or what am I trying to say? It's a way of God showing His power in the world through such people. So there was that side of it as well, but then in the 19th century, in the period that the book focuses on, really there is an understanding of these outcasts as being, I think, not necessarily less than fully human, but not fully alive. They're seen as being on the boundary between living and dead. And so that understanding of them as being half in this world and half out of this world is very important in all kinds of different ways. And in terms of fetishization, yes, because especially again during the cholera wedding, there's a way of understanding it, which I advocate in the book, which is kind of like a freak show or a circus of some kind.
Yeah.
And that's the sense in which these people are seen as grotesque in some way. And in fact, there are even explanations of the cholera wedding which specifically say, well, pious Jews are not allowed to go to the theater or the circus, and we need to be able to lift our spirits during the epidemic, and this is how we do it. So they're basically equating the cholera wedding with a kind of entertainment. And there are other sources that I point to as well in the book, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. It's an interesting question that may or may not be easy to answer, and that is, how did gender affect who was marginalized and how they were treated?
Yeah, that is a very important question, and I try to get at it in the book. I don't know if I really did it justice. Let's see. There's a question about when we're talking about physical appearance, for example, the physical deformities or ugliness are described and related to in different ways when it comes to men and women. So there's often a certain kind of mocking that we see in many of the sources, a mocking of Jewish women who are in some ways physically unfit, whether, whatever it may be, she limps or she has blind in her right eye or something like that. And there's a kind of different attitude there than the one that we often hear in relationship to men. So that's kind of off the top of my head. That's one example of how the sexes or how gender plays a role in all of this. And there's also more broadly, there's a tremendous amount of misogyny that I found among some of the progressive Jewish writers of the time, of the 19th century, who some of them actually point to Jewish women and they say they're the reason that we have all of these deformed Jewish children running around. And why is that? Because there was often a complaint among the Jewish progressives and reformers at the time that Jewish women were too active economically. And they were active economically. That was something that was well known about Jewish women. They often were in the storefronts and they helped their husbands with the businesses, or even the husbands helped them with the businesses. So Jewish women were very much front and center. And that was something that the rather bourgeois reformers with their Victorian sensibilities did not like at all. So there was also an element there of blaming women, which is not the first time in history this has happened, of blaming women for a new generation of children who are not what they should be. And that's a
Right.
kind of interesting element of the kind of interesting dynamic that I tried to pull out a little bit in the book.
That's a great point. There's a question here that really, I think, points up the relevance of your work to contemporary politics and political discussion. And here's the question. In many Jewish circles in the US, people who raise concerns about the occupation of the West Bank and other concerns regarding human rights of Palestinians becoming marginalized are sometimes labeled as self-loathing Jews. Do you see this as being in continuity with the kinds of phenomena you explore in your work, or do you see it as a sort of inversion of those phenomena, or in some other way?
Right. That's a really good question. Really interesting. Well, like we said before, I think Jewish self-hatred is obviously, it's not a new phenomenon, and certainly not new for any minority. And at that time that I'm talking about in the book, it also was used as a tool of Jews against other Jews, right? So that also is not new.
Yeah.
For there to be a Jewish group or faction which lobs that at another Jewish group and says, well, you're saying that because you just hate yourselves. And that's what Zionists would say to the people who wanted to integrate or assimilate into European society. They said, well, you're ashamed of your Jewishness. So the fact that it's happening today, yes, I think there is a history to that. And I think it's worth trying to understand why it is that we still see that today. And obviously the subject of Jewish self-hatred is one that we could spend a whole other hour talking about. But I do think it's interesting that that someone thought of it in this context as well, because you know, I'm a historian. I tend to think mostly about the 19th century, early 20th century, but it's fascinating to meditate on some of these implications for today.
Looks like we have time for one more question. The book focuses on Eastern European Jews. Do you know if any of the behaviors and customs discussed among this community vis-a-vis the marginalized are mirrored in Jewish communities elsewhere in the world?
That's a great question. I don't know, and I probably should know, but I don't know other Jewish communities well enough to know. I mean, much of Jewish folklore has common threads across the world, across communities. So, you know, Yemen, Iraq, Algeria, Poland. I mean, there are a lot of common threads. I've never seen the cholera wedding anywhere else, you know, in any other community, other than, as I mentioned before, in Ottoman Palestine. But those were mostly East European Jews who were carrying that out. So in terms of, it would be interesting. Someone does need, I think, to look at other Jewish communities and try to understand if there was, you know, who were their outcasts? Are they similar? That's something that I don't know yet. It's research still to be done. So probably a future Cullman Fellow will look into that.
And he'll give you a call. We're going to have to bring it to a close, but I do think that even though we don't have a crowd on hand, we should all give Natan a virtual ovation. And because, you know, obviously he's a man in complete command of his subject, and that subject is absolutely riveting. So thank you very much, Natan. It's been great talking.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's been a lot of fun.
Black text on white background. New York Public Library lion logo, 125 years. Learn more about the New York Public Library, nypl.org.